Okie dokie. It is 7 o'clock, and I would like to welcome everybody to the AGM talk of Jacob Scheier. And he is the writer in residence at the University of Manitoba. And his talk is called The Mad Artists in the 21st Century. And I'll just read a bio of Jacob. Jacob Scheier is a Canadian poet, essayist, and journalist. He's the author of 3 full-length poetry collections with ECW Press, including the Governor General's Award, winning More to Keep Us Warm, 2007. His most recent collection, Is This Scary, 2021, explores the radical subjectivity of chronic mental and physical illness. His poems have been published in numerous magazines, journals, and anthologies, as well as nominated for a National Magazine Award and longlisted for the CBC Poetry Prize. Jacob is also the author of My Never-Ending Acid Trip, a hybrid work of literary journalism and memoir, published as an ebook with the Toronto Star. And his personal essays have appeared in a number of publications, including Brick, the Globe and Mail, and the Globe and Mail. He is currently the writer in residence at the Centre for Creative Writing and Oral Culture at the University of Manitoba. Welcome, Jacob. Please take it away.
Okay, thank you for that introduction, Diane, and thank you for inviting me to speak at your AGM. Appreciate the opportunity. So what I'm going to do is do a mix of talking about my topic, the mad artist / poet in 21st century, and reading from the book Diane mentioned, which I have right here because I'll be reading from it, is scary. So let me begin. So writing, or let me say that this book largely chronicles a severe depressive episode I had about 7 years ago, give or take, lasting close to a year, including a few weeks in psych ward in Toronto. And I wrote a portion, at least I wrote a good portion of the poems while in the thick of that very severe depression. And later I would, recovered several years later. I started like looking at the poems and revising more, thinking in terms of publication, which I wasn't at the time I was writing them. I wasn't sure I was going to, actually live. I wasn't sure. I was undecided whether I was going to continue living at that particular point in my life. So there's a little background on the book. Now that it's like it's been out in the world for over a year, it has caused me to, think about the object I created and kind of reverse engineer the theories around it. And with writing about mental illness, or mental health struggles, as I prefer to call them, on one hand, we have the medical model. This is the biochemical origins, the role society plays, and the lack of support people have in these struggles is kind of ignored in the medical model, right? And that everyone is kind of clumped. Everyone has a certain cluster of symptoms, or some, 5 out of the 12 symptoms that you find in a diagnostic and statistical manual, the kind of Bible of psychiatry. And so it's not really so there's a natural and necessary desire to break, to push back against that that narrowing, and I don't think the medical model is not without its benefits, even though it has many harms as well. These things, it's all very sticky. But on the other hand, what I realized, though I wasn't so conscious at the time of writing it, more so was editing it, is there's this trope, right, of romanticized trope of sometimes it's referred to as like the quote unquote mad genius, the mad artist, and certain figures, I'm going to talk about poets, but but say Van Gogh and where his place in the cultural imagination. There's someone who clearly suffered a great deal and probably wasn't romanticizing his life. I don't know, I wasn't there, but I imagine. And I'll say that the experience isn't romantic, and I'll say capital R romantic, as in the period we call in literature romanticism, and in other facets of the humanities. But here's where, and I'm not a literature prof, right? But so I'm not super confident when I say this, but I think a very cursory history to trace back, like where this idea comes from, or this trope develops, is, I think, was romanticism, or at least most distinctly where the feelings of the individual become like really important, and as well outside, in a more secular way, the sense of the visionary, so it's more individualistic as opposed to mystical visions of like the Middle Ages, right? But those had to sort of fit into a certain the visions had to be very particular, else you were a heretic, right? So this is, in the romantic period, your divisions are not, not managed in this way. So I'm just looking over some notes I have. So I have some influence from the British romantics, Shelley, Keats, Wordsworth, Blake, who in their different ways kind of encapsulate the visionary posture, and are their lives, and they romanticized themselves as being kind of outside the norm, and Shelley in particular sort of nicknamed Mad Shelley, and a term Shelley used to describe his own poetry as a harmonizing madness. So there's this celebration of quote unquote madness, however they defined it. There's also kind of privileged guys, right? But in any case, I have another quote here from a poet who's not technically of that period, a little later, Arthur Rimbaud, so post-romantic French symbolist, and terminology, not that important. But this quote: "A poet makes himself a visionary through a systematic derangement of the senses." So I think these are just two figures who, in their biography, Shelley and Rimbaud, I mean, whose biographies, they are people who struggled with what would, if they saw psychiatrists, they would certainly follow under mental illness, and were saw themselves as visionaries, and for whatever else we might say about them, I think wrote extremely interesting and beautiful poems. No, so on one hand, I think that I think the suffering mind, can maybe have insights that might not have. So I don't also want to delegitimize artistic insight in the throes of such conditions entirely. But what isn't helpful or is problematic and potentially dangerous is kind of this idea of the mad genius slash poet as, kind of a unicorn with these magical visionary powers, which implicitly turns anyone else who isn't creating art, but who is, diagnosed with a mental illness, going what we might call a psychiatric consumer survivor. Their journey is like devoid of value if they're not producing something. So it sort of gets trapped in, I think, a capitalist framework. And it's just like a devaluing of a person's experience and creating a kind of hierarchy of whose lives are more valued than others. And as an anecdote, anecdote, I was treated much nicer in the psych ward I was in St. Michael's Hospital psych ward for a few weeks in 2005. And then 10 years later, and Diane mentioned biography that, I wrote this ebook for Toronto Star. Long story, I'll touch on a little later and talk. There's all to say that I think being older and being a white man, but I think that I was treated with dignity I did not receive 10 years before that. Because I was a writer, I had this profession, and maybe they wanted to be written nicely about, I don't know, just theorizing some things. I say that about this like hierarchy of like the value of a person, whereas someone who was, other people weren't treated as well as me, as I observed. Okay. And oh yeah, and another problem I identified about this trope is sort of suggests that like that mental illness is to be redeemed through art. And it's kind of, people probably promote this language, there's a kind of embedded cure narrative, I think, in it. Or and at least or at least there's a kind of overcoming, but more accurately, that it's salvic, right? And so these are all things that are not helpful to an accurate rendering of the experience, of like really difficult mental health struggles. So to bring this back to more specifically, the chronicling of the depressive episode, though it touches on this in the book, begins was like a reaction to the cortisol steroid prednisone, because I also have autoimmune disease and I had a very bad flare-up. I need to take this drug, which exacerbated my anxiety in particular quite severely. The other thing it did, and if you want, I feel like I'm going to go over something a little wild quickly, so stay with me on this. But a side effect that I also experienced from antidepressants was what are called visual disturbances. So technically not hallucinations. It's much more similar to what one might see on like a hallucinogenic drug trip, things like halos around objects, and like trails, seeing part of an object after it's like past you, after it's moved past your line of vision. these sorts of things. So I have this, and that's what the ebook for Toronto Star was about the first time, 2005. So here I kind of was experiencing Rimbaud's derangement of the senses in a sense, but it was not. It was terrifying and debilitating. And it's poorly understood. It's very rare, so it's poorly understood and held for its particular heart to find. That's all. So with all that background, I want to read a poem from the book, which is called Palinopsia, or Ode to Some Fucking Bird, is the name of the poem. And in it, I make reference to the John Keats poem, Ode to a Nightingale, which essentially the poem is about having a vision of the eternity, but very fleeting through the song of this bird, really simplifying a rather layered poem, right? But so in some ways, as you'll see, this poem talks about like having these visions is a rather tortuously mundane experience, or these visual disturbances. So I will read the poem. I confess there's something lovely about you, red smear, outside the window, pecking the fallen grain. A cardinal or warbler, perhaps. I don't give a shit what kind of bird you are. I haven't done my research into the red birds of Southern Ontario. Before the accident, I would have admonished my students for writing about anything without doing their homework. I can't explain how entirely irrelevant your name is to me, how to make an image for the pain of not caring. It's like the pain of not caring. I would have told them then, if you can't explain, you're not trying hard enough, because writing is finding words for those who claim words fail. I'm not trying hard enough. It doesn't matter if I was right then. I only know writing is like my medication. It might be stopping me from dying, which is not the same thing as keeping me alive. I can't explain it better than that, or I refuse. There's a language game we could play over whether a perception of a flapping red thing is still a bird. If I cannot see you properly, whatever you're named, do you still function as a vision? Keats's nightingale flares and smears a neurological malady that dies with him. I watch you, mortal smudge. It was the contrast of your deep red feathers against the green tint of a browning roof. To admire or despise, to go on or not go on, to record your beauty, ugly. I celebrate you, small red beet, out of protest. This poem, which hopefully like illustrates some of what I'm talking about, with the not ensuring not to romanticize what could be in this context and history of the mad poet visionary. I think I might skip ahead a little bit because I realize I've been talking for nearly 20 minutes and I'm not the best at keeping track of time. Okay, so we would say the other side of this, like thinking of myself or myself as an artist, particularly poet, is caught in writing about mental illness, is caught between, say, a pole on one side of like romanticizing and the other pole of this medical model, which purely like reduces to sickness and treatment. So one of the projects of the book is to express the radical subjectivity of mental suffering, and as opposed to that labeling and reducing to a set of symptoms, treatment plan that the experiences of these sorts of states are unique, and I think some people's could be dehumanized in this system under the medical model. So I also right from my own, trying to articulate what my experience is like as distinct. So I'm going to read a poem called Noonday Yahweh. And maybe become clear from the poem, but during this depression, my secular Jewish background became, or my Jewishness became relevant in a way it usually isn't in my life, culturally, historically, and it not in a great way, as you may get ascertain from the poem. So this is Noonday Yahweh, which begins with an epigraph from Sylvia Plath, not God, but a swastika. You speak my name from behind a dark bush, but on closer look, a thick, short mustache, hard to tell, the little tramp or Mein Kampf. One never sees your face, something black and burly following me. Your cartoon nimbus gives me hope. You're coming in a whirlwind. I don't care what is said, just take me somewhere ordinary, a Kansas of the mind. I pray to your iconic stash. Bristles my hair like a spider crawled in there. I do not see you in a bush, not in a tree, not in a car. You let me be. I went to Shoal and found the Führer. I prayed in the wrong direction, not even the right house. I wandered aimless into Shell. Understandable for lost Jew, sow, like myself, abandoned, I believed, our nondescript how. Our fathers left us to find it in the mind. I tried to describe, but comes out Heil. Sartre was wrong. It's not our people, but your cloudy self falling in big, dark chunks, like a long beard sheared. Abaddon, a blank page for scribbling stashes till the whole space is black. There's a few gaps. Rabbi L. Cohen said, there's a crack in everything, even in my Hitler mustache. That's how the light gets thin. I'm trying to express like the sort of darkness of my experience, and a sort of self-inflicted persecution. So that's not in the DSM. I mean, that's like the main point I'm trying to make. So I'm going to try to tie things together here messily, because all of this is messy, and it's so I offer no solution to a problem I identify, but that it's a kind of a wrestling that needs to be constantly negotiated. So as I said before, I'm someone who has interacted for most of my adult life with psychiatry, not entirely voluntarily, although sometimes voluntarily, and have been hurt by the system, like including like drug side effects, which they sort of, when the meds don't work the way they're supposed to, they or at least psychiatrists I've encountered can sometimes blame the patient. What's that? I can't think of the term. If you don't respond well to antidepressants, they have like a term that basically implies like there's something wrong with your brain, as opposed to like maybe the meds aren't like really very good, or at least for you, like. So anyway, I'm getting a little away from the topic, I think. Just say that I conflicted because I have been helped. I'm on medication, and after much searching for a medication that helped me instead of hurt me, I ended up on this medication, which is called lamotrigine, which is more often given for bipolar depression, but is more sometimes, as is my case, given for quote unquote unipolar depression, major depressive disorder, and in short, seems to have stabilized me relatively, as well as not having the sort of the terrible reactions I experienced to other medications. So what I want to read to you is it's the poem. The poem is an ode. I have a few of these odes to medication, and what an ode is, in case you don't know, is it's a praising and loving address to like a person or a thing, in short. So this is one of those poems that I think expresses the messiness and complexity of when talking about sort of stuck between the romanticism and the medical model. Sorry, I'm having a little trouble finding it. I found it. The poem expresses there's a great deal of fear in taking this medication because you can actually, rare side effect is like a skin burning rash that could be deadly, lethal if not treated immediately. So the poem engages like this possibility, which fortunately avoided. Again, this difficulty, the way the double-edgedness of this psychiatric world. Lamotrigine song. Visit the Google Images gallery of side effects and see leprosy in a hurry, bodies charcoaled, still lives, all of history in you. I brought you home from the hospital pharmacy, swaddled in plastic, rattling beside impulse buys, chewing gum for boredom, scratch card to test my luck. I heard you tap against the child-proof lid. 0.08% get the rash. Pogrom skin, 1 in 10 receive a scarlet warning, and just in case must be taken from you. My pink miracle, suicide inhibitor, provider of not faith but will to endure absurdity without levity. The suicide in me desired to be incinerated, body a pyre, metamorphosis, I've become the rash entirely, allegorical of nothing. Reflect feelings not found on the emotion wheel, blood libeled, skin thieved, fleshless, shame deeper than biblical. Unlike the psych, people would visit me in the burn ward. I dreamt of pity and fire. More of me wanted to want life. I tried you, lamotrigine, a year ago. Now pop was a Claritin at 8 a.m., impatiently watching the coffee drip and check my skin, then get on, was this, ellipses of breaths. Okay. So the last thing I wanted to say on this sort of meandering subject or meandering talk is about the stigma and romanticization of the psych ward space. So the poets, some poets who we really kind of are romanticized for both psychiatric institution and in some cases suicide, and most significantly or most famously Sylvia Plath, but also her contemporaries like in terms of the institutionalization, Robert Lowell, John Berryman, Anne Sexton, so on. And these become sort of romantic figures. If you actually go back and read their poems, they actually do present this experience of institutionalization as boring in a disquieting way. and I was quite influenced by Plath, probably more than any other poet in writing this book. So I think that's also a space that I think it's the more something is romanticized, the more it becomes an unreal place in the sort of popular or public imagination, which isn't helpful, right? It's the stigma and the romanticization should go hand in hand. This is like the phrase like the don't use anymore, but like what it connotates the asylum, right? And it's scary and people are unpredictable and things. And truth is, anyone spending time in one of these places, they're intensely, my experiences are, it's intensely boring, and time just like kind of freezes. So I want to present that in the book, to kind of demystify this experience that is often portrayed in popular culture as, you know, as frightening in particular. You know, think of the escape mental patient trope and such. So, so I'm going to read you a sonnet series. What's the word? I won't blather about the sonnet form. I'll just read the poems, or the sort of one poem in 3 sections, short. And then, okay, this is circular labyrinths. 1. After 8 p.m. snack, we slouch a dozen laps of corridors circling a cement meadow. A citadel defends against the horizon, nothing in the center of the center. We passed a hall burned with Monets, circle the lily pond and drown a little each time. It's too green, hurts a faraway hurt, like the moment after burning oneself, pain and the memory of pain. We talk around attempts till our pink pills spike, pastel wounds bleed sleep for the night. For our safety, we can't be trusted with thread, a symptom, delusion of protagonists, lost. Soon the hero will find us and will at last be slain. 2. Ativan, at last, gabapentin, PRN, Tim Hortons, breakfast, Klonopin, nurse's station Q, smokes, lunch, PRN, snack time, slowly unraveling tinsel lids, ideation on scale from 1 to 10, anxiety on a scale from 1 to 10, privileges revoked, nicotine inhalers, a visitor cancels, computer queue, Googled side effects, quiet hours, conspiracies regarding lizard people, Chopin, PRN, Harlequins, Gideons, the lilies considered, Klonopin, HDTV, Blue Jays, Yellow Leaves, ballots cast, results, moment stretched, safety plans, activities, someone in restraints, inpatient elevator, ECT, unseen at breakfast, soon forgotten, PRN, more or less. 3. More or less, we escaped at last by way of untruth. Carved ideation with plastic knives. All those hours whittled could have been spent turning inhalers to shivs. Opposite, depending on perspective, of self-defense. We puffed, silent kazoos sealing our lips. Released at last, turns out the outside is more corridors called streets. We returned to the Starbucks in which we spent our passes, discussed the way nothing has changed more. I search my pocket for smokes, find the stone totem a friend gave is gone. Inside, I held to the thought, it works if I believe or not. Out here, lost, also in free, more or less. After 8 p.m. snack, we slouch a dozen laps. That's the final poem I want to share. And yeah, so I think it's appropriate to end the talk by sharing a boring poem about psychiatric institution. So thank you for listening to me ramble on about all of that and listening to my poems. And now if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Jacob. Do folks have any questions or comments or things they'd like to discuss? Janelle?
Yeah, I just wanted to start off by saying thank you so much, Jacob. I also live with mental illness, so pretty much everything you said I can relate to, especially that line you said, boring and incidental. Is that what you had said about the psych wards, boring and
I definitely said boring. I may have said the one, may have said it's dazzle, or I don't remember now.
but I could absolutely relate to that. So that was, yeah, I've loved everything you said. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm wondering, you talk a lot about the medical model, Jacob. Of course, medical model is that professionals, particularly doctors, are going to fix us as people with disabilities. Have you thought about the social model and how that relates to your work? The social model being that there are barriers to participation that are attitudinal and that are physical and systemic in society. And I actually thought to myself, I think that some of the things you described could also be social model barriers. You talk about stigma, you talk about the attitudes of doctors kind of being in your way, right? The fact that drugs don't work, but everyone pretends they do, right? That kind of thing. Just wondering if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I'm sure. Well, be honest with, at the time I wrote the initial poems, the very first ones were, scribbled when they eventually would allow me to have a pen, were written actually in a psych word. I had never, at that point in my life, I'd never heard of the social model of disability. It'd be a few years later, when I decided to do a graduate degree a bit later in life, that I became aware. I'd never taken disability studies class, and really opened up a lot for me. So I'd really be answering that question. And when I came to actually editing the book, I considered this as in the ways you speak of as in giving description and lyricism and images and some narrative to my experiences, especially in the psych ward, where they're not like terribly helpful. You're not there to get well, you're there to not be a liability. But for instance, so I wanted to, express some failures in the system, or the way the system actually is creating the very problem it's saying it's trying to help you with. But at the same time, it wasn't that theoretical background. Maybe I think I probably understood on somewhat of intuitive level from experience, but I didn't have I didn't have that consciousness around at the time of writing. But I say it's just add to that, and yet it ends up in there, which is interesting, I think, right?
Yeah, and if you had had that consciousness, how would you have written your poems differently about the psych ward? Or what do you think you would have?
Be honest, it's really hard to answer that question, because would be involve some kind of counterfactual thinking. I don't know, since I don't want, unlike when I write essays, in some ways I turn to poetry to get away from, I don't want to be in my own work, be too didactic. In my poetry, I think that's why I also have the more prose, or more say things more explicitly. and offer opinions in a way that I don't so much do in my poems. So I guess in some ways I'm answering like, I don't think it would change that much, but I also can't say.
Right, right. Yeah, interesting. Brennan.
Hi there.
Hi.
First of all, thank you very much for the talk. It was really interesting and I appreciated it. I'm the sort of person who it usually takes me a while to process something before I come up with a perfectly articulated question, but I'm going to give it a go here. You had mentioned, just sort of in passing that you work in journalism as well as in poetry. And so I wonder, and I'm making an assumption, I guess, because I'm not familiar with your work in journalism, but if you do work, in discussing the same sorts of themes within both spheres, which maybe you do. That's what I kind of assumed. Do you find that that those themes are received in different ways based on the medium or the sphere? Just interesting, or it'd be interesting
Right.
to hear your thoughts on that.
Sorry, I'm just gonna ask a question to make sure I'm answering your question.
Yeah.
So do you mean in terms of how it is received, like how it's received by an audience?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. What
Right.
what
Okay.
is the perception like? Yeah. Mhm.
Well, and I mean, like I mentioned, this thing I could turn into an ebook, falling under genre of literary journalism, where it was like, and more of the journalism is done is a first, is first person, some sort of a character, you could say, the narrator enters the story. And I was written about quite a lot of things, but in terms of you get it's a much larger and broader audience, and I wrote it in a way with that in mind, and in some ways I guess I don't know what Toronto Star is at, like an 8th or 10th grade reading level, which means like just writing, which isn't like to insult your Toronto Star, but just that it's a very different genre, and they actually that project they had for a while didn't ultimately turn out, but there was like I got paid. It was you just know you're writing for a much larger audience, and you're trying to make things palpable, and it's nice to be read by more people. And I think more recently, I've written Globe and Mail about being immunocompromised in the pandemic. I think maybe it's a better example. And I know I'm reaching thousands of readers, right? As a Globe and Mail, where like I've sold like around 500 copies of this poetry book, right? So readership is really small.
Mhm.
And so in some ways I allow myself to just do whatever I want, whatever feels right. And I'm not thinking so much about audience, which is the nice luxury of writing in a genre that like very few people read, and it's never, there's there's very little possibility of making money in it. So not, yeah, so it is quite different. I'm not sure if does that answer the question? I'm not sure if I'm doing a good job of answering that.
That does, yeah. Thank you.
Okay,
Yeah, it's
sure.
interesting to kind of know how you've experienced both. So thank you. Mhm.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Anybody else? I'm just thinking, and I am taking Jacob's Crip Poetics seminar right now that's being offered through U of M. And Jacob has been talking a lot about what is Crip Poetics? What does it mean when we crip something? Jacob, maybe give us a summary of how your work is Crip Poetics.
Right. Well, and I think this goes back to your a question, earlier question. I didn't read them. More recent poems I was doing over the past couple of years had more of a disability consciousness. It was things that, but I think I can find it in this book, right? Like in the retrospect. But I think one of the things is getting away from somewhat inherited traditions and expectations, and trying to make the form and shape of the poem reflect my, especially more recent poems, embodied experience in the world, as someone was saying, autoimmune disease, but also like the way my mind was perceiving it, the world in the time of this depressive episode. And so somewhat organically for this book, the amount, it's hard, I don't know how well I'm just pulling out random poem. There's a lot of I don't even say that. So there's a lot of like white space, and that was as opposed to being, although I have these too, as opposed to being like a very kind of neat set of like four lines or quatrains. And so the form was more reflecting my experience, and not, I didn't do it to be so deliberately pushing back against the conventions, but in retrospect, it does somewhat, and more the recent work is more consciously doing that. So that's it's part of what I think cryptpoetics is reflecting, a different way than the able-bodied or able-minded subject position in the world, and allowing other people into that consciousness, so they're to expand their own world as well.
Okay. Yes, great. And we talk in visual art about a similar thing, right? That in our visual art as crypts, we're often breaking mainstream kind of expectations too, particularly around the body and the mind, things like that. Yeah. Anybody else? I have another question, so I'm going to ask it. You mentioned the capitalist view that we have to be producing at all times.
Mm-hmm.
And this just resonates with me right now, because I broke my ankle this summer and I was in bed for 6 weeks on bed rest. And, my immediate reaction was, what am I going to produce during this time? And I completed a poetry manuscript that was in motion and sent it to the publisher. And I felt so good about myself, because I was lying in bed and I was thinking all about revisions to poems and doing this. Yeah, it really is kind of capitalist. And were you thinking that when you were writing your book?
Yeah.
About your episode of mental illness?
Well, this I think is the weirdness of being, speaking for myself, I'm pretty, I'm certainly an anti-capitalist, ideologically speaking. And it is the strangeness of like this in some ways is a commodity, right? Not a very lucrative one, but and all this production value and so on. And in some ways writing in an or creating an art form that is not give really commercial success. So there's award culture, but that's maybe it's too much to bring into this. But that itself is a kind of rejection of capitalist norms. So in some ways, yes, it's being productive, but you're producing something that's not that's not very useful in turn, for in a capitalist society. And it's actually going to annoy a lot of people that you spend time doing that because it's not seen as like actual work. And yet anyone who's an artist knows it's actually a lot of work, and then we could get a discussion of like what is work. But what this, I don't, ironically, I'm worried this will sound romantic. Because I did not, I was not thinking about publication when I was writing the initial drafts. I was not considering what, you have you start creating art, and then if you find yourself, I woke up one day as a professional poet. I barely know how this happened, right? But now you're in it, then you're thinking about grants, you're thinking about teaching the career side of it, which in some ways we do have to survive under capitalism, and you'd rather probably survive as an artist, in your case academic, than as doing spreadsheets in office. Probably prefer that, I would think, right? Nothing against people who are doing spreadsheets in office, but I'm just saying so it's just a constant negotiation and compromise. But I say during that initial time, because I was, I really had trouble leaving my room in the apartment, and I was just very disengaged with like the outside world, like maybe as preparation to be in pandemic, I don't know. But it was really an act, so I worry about being sounding too romantic. It was somewhat of an act of survival to make meaning of a very tormented experience, a lot of suffering, and it sort of gave me a reason to get up every day and it felt necessary. And then later, get into the publishing. And in a weird way, I could be like nostalgic for the not caring. I was too depressed to care about these things at that time.
Right.
And in some ways, the capitalism hates depression, which is why they have drugs and really quick fix therapies, like cognitive behavioral therapy, which has helped me a lot. So when I talk about these things, I'm also not knocking them, but they're complicated. I don't know. It's a roundabout way of addressing your question, I hope.
Yeah, so you're almost saying writing is healing. And in terms of us being people with disabilities, there has always been that thing around art therapy, right? In the visual arts, that disabled people can heal themselves. Would you say it's about healing as well? Or is it about just having voice, giving voice to your experience so that others know?
I would think it's more the latter, and healing's a tricky one, right? Because it's I guess it all depends how we like define the word. But I think like as for me, say it's because I already mentioned Sylvia Plath. Like her poems were particularly meaningful at the time. I felt like articulated some of my experience, and so that if this book, these poems can do that for someone else, I think that is, it's not actually the first time it's written about say depression, and I say it's my first book. I had rare for a poet to receive what you might call a fan letter, but have someone write to me and tell me that it helped them in their own depression kind of just understand or feel less alone. And I think that was actually what got me into writing poems in the first place, was reading poems that made me feel less alone in very challenging experiences. I don't know, and I honestly don't know about. I'll tell sort of some illustrate my confusion over this. And sometimes I wonder if writing all those poems made the depression last longer because I went deeper, and I went to some really like archetypal underground and not. And it's like I allowed myself to do that. So, and it maybe maybe it was healing, but say compared, and something I've been meaning to write an essay about, but I haven't gone around to it yet. That a few years later, I had so depressed. I also had a hospitalization, and I ended up taking it. That's when I started a medication I mentioned, lamotrigine, and was doing pretty intensive CBT therapy. And it was like I was back to functioning, and you can argue like, what does it mean to help someone function under in a sick society, which I would describe capitalism, right? But in any case, I was out of what can be a very dangerous situation, to be that depressed, to be suicidal, much quicker. And I didn't write. I didn't write much. I didn't want to go back to that place. So it's sort of rich at the bottom, but I don't. But it's peril. It's full of peril. So it's a tricky one. I think it helped me survive as well, which maybe is healing.
Yeah. Oh, some things for me to think about there. Very, very interesting. Janelle, sorry, it's not Janelle. Susan is at Janelle's camera. I'm just reading the print. Susan, you had a question or comment.
Yeah, I just had a quick comment. I totally agree with what Jacob is saying. When I'm doing my art, it's almost like I'm compelled to do the art, and I can't not do the art. There's nothing else that I can do, and it doesn't matter whether I'm depressed or not. I have to do it, and unfortunately, I'm on a disability pension. It costs me money to do it. I don't make money. In fact, most of the artwork I do is it's exhibitions, it's sculptural or whatever, and it's not something that people are going to buy. It'll be something that they just come and see. And so, I mean, I might get a grant to make it, and then I'll exhibit it, and they'll come and see it, and then it'll come and sit in my basement for the rest of the, until it's exhibited again. And so basically, I have enough money to make it and exhibit it, and that's it. And I'm on a disability pension. I don't make money doing my art. Mm-hmm. It's not a capitalist thing for me. Right. It's basically, and I don't do it to make for therapy. I don't do it to make myself feel better. I do it because that's just it's in my brain. I think sorry, it's I didn't catch your name because it's not Janelle. No, sorry, Susan Landon. Susan. So yeah. I think you actually answered. I wish I'd could have taken your answer and actually answered that way for Diane's question, because there is just a compulsion in certain days. Certain days are like terrible days for me. I will just move words around on the page. It's this like compulsive activity, and like I can't do. It feels like I can't do anything else. There's just like this compulsive side to it. So yeah, I really relate to what you just said. Yeah. Yeah, and then other days I just want to read a book or sleep. Yeah. So, and I'd like to also to say that I really, really enjoyed your work. Thank you so much. Thank you. Anyway, that's all I have to say.
Okay. Does anybody, we're almost out of time. Does anyone have a quick question or comment, something they want to say? Okay, well, thanks so much, Jacob, for joining us and for your very enlightening and, what can I say, deep talk and reading. As I said, it's got me thinking about a lot of things, and I'm sure others are also thinking about a lot of things. And we were happy to host you today. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Okay, so I think we will adjourn, folks. This is the end of our lecture for the AGM. And everybody have a good night. Take care.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye.